Take number 387, my lecture on the problem of free will. There we go. I'm not sure this is going to work for y'all. Okay, so I'm going to redo this entire lecture, but I'm going to break it down into chunks so that you can watch this at your relative leisure. We'll start with the problem of free will. I really like this particular topic because I think it's very important to a lot of the ways we think about ourselves and our relationships with others. Our very ability to have control over the conduct of our lives. And it has a lot to do with how we determine whether or not someone is morally responsible for their behavior, up to and including ourselves. And it also intersects a number of very interesting and important philosophical ideas about metaphysics, for one thing, epistemology, etc. So what I'd like to do first, usually when I lecture this, is to ask you what you think free will is, to kind of get a sense of what's important to you about free will. Free will is, it's really a term of art, is what we call it in philosophy. It's not actually a definition that you would see like in the Oxford English Dictionary. That when we say term of art in philosophy, we're accepting the idea that the concept we're talking about can differ in what it means relative to what we're addressing at the present time. So there's not considered to be a hard and fast definition of free will, and get over it. So there's this term of art also applies to other kinds of concepts like justice, morality, goodness, and so forth. It is argued just about meaning in language in general. I'm thinking particularly about Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein proposes that language really gets its meaning in the flow of life, that meaning is ultimately context dependent for all of our verbal interactions, at least, that what is happening has a lot to do with it. So it doesn't just necessarily apply to terms of art, but that kind of context relevance applies to all our interactions. That's just one view about meaning in language. Okay. I'm going to give you some examples to think about. Usually when we talk about free will, right, we're talking about making a decision. It's, okay, I could, my classic decision, which is where you're waiting for line for ice cream, and you could pick either chocolate or vanilla, and you could do either, right? That's to be free means that you could pick either one, right? That's just not predetermined that you're going to choose one or the other. Sometimes we talk about the idea of could have done otherwise. So I chose the vanilla, but I was sufficiently free that I could have also chosen the chocolate. I had to pick between the two, and there's perhaps an alternate universe in which I chose chocolate. But it's not really So it's not necessarily all that exotic a concept, and something you kind of use every day in that sense. I want you to think though about some, that there's gradations perhaps of freeness. Um, Thinking about animals. Do animals possess, free will? Can they make choices? The example I like to think about is a bird making a nest. Um, does there's a lot of, it seems, decision making that goes into the making of a nest for a bird, like what materials to use, how to put them together, and where to put them. And birds apparently that have been raised independently from other birds, that don't learn from other birds, can also make nests. It's seen as being an instinctual process. Um, so, but it has a lot of analysis seeming to go with it, which is kind of interesting. Um, but really, what we think the bird is doing is following a sort of decision tree, right? A flow chart in their heads, and they go, well, this is too close to where the cat hangs out, so I'm not going to put this here. This branch is not strong enough to support what I need, so I'm going to look over here. This bird is yelling at me about being over here, so I'm going to go over there. But it just kind of goes through this little um, decision tree to determine where to put the nest and what to make the nest out of, and so on. So there's a sense in which it is making choices, perhaps, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is free in the same way that we do as human beings. I like to think about two different autonomic processes. First of all, digesting food. Do you have a choice over how how and when you digest your food, assuming you've eaten it, right? You've swallowed it. Can you control your own digestion? Alas, no. Unless we think about maybe making yourself throw it back up. But so digesting food seems to be a process about which we don't really have any control. However, your heart rate, which is also an autonomic process, we do have some control over it, right? We can express our will with regard to our heart rate. We can try to relax and have deep breathing exercises and make our heart rate slow down. Or we can go read the news and have our heart rate speed up. So we can, perhaps change our heart rate in some contexts. Um, but we cannot will our heart, for instance, to stop beating. So we have some control, but not complete, as opposed to digesting food where we don't seem to have really any. A different example, this is the quintessential example of something that doesn't act per se, but moves. But it's clear that there's no free will that's expressed with this. A rock rolling downhill. That last rainstorm, finally washed away the sand that was holding the stone in place at the top of the hill, and it rolls down the hill. Well, the pathway it takes, right, is not at all subject to any choices on the part of the stone, right? The stone has seemingly no parts or ability to sense things or ability to make decisions. So that is, the path that it takes is perfectly outside of its control. This is an example of what we mean by a determinism, right? This is a determined circumstance where the shape and the presence of water and different stones and perhaps a cow or two is going to determine where this thing goes. And it's completely outside of the control of the rock, and it is completely determined. Right. Baking a cake. I think this would be like a traditional kind of human decision making process in which we choose to go do a thing, and we engage in the process by making decisions and choices and probably substitutions. Very definite act of human will, right? Um, Going for a walk is also uh, usually something that we can will for ourselves to do unless you have a dog. Uh, Considering Descartes. We will come back to Descartes when we look at attempts that have been made to kind of resolve some of the problems with regard to free will. We'll look at the Cartesian dualism model once we complete this particular unit. We could also break things down into talking about freedom of action versus freedom of choice. Freedom of action, that's our ability to be able to, do something, to, you're not tied down so you can get up and walk around kind of thing. Right now, our freedom of action is very constrained to an extent. We can't get out the car and go driving and roam around the park or something. We can't go hang out at the mall as the kids used to do, because we're all under the stay-at-home order. Anyway, so that's a freedom of action issue, but it's not clear that necessarily influences our freedom of choice, right? If I could, I would do the following, and I can freely think about going here and going there and doing these things, and it's my choice is not hindered, but it's my action that's hindered. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. All right. One more concept, and then I will move on to the next slide. Arthur Schopenhauer, very bitter man. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. And we're going to look at an experiment by Benjamin Libet from the 1980s, and what implications that might have for concepts of freedom of the will. The idea is that we don't have control over what it is that we want to do, that we actually have to do things that are the mind, the unconscious just sort of cooks things up, and the conscious mind decides which things it actually wants to do. The unconscious mind kicks up the desire to, kick somebody in the shins